Hello and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Director and Business Line Leader for our medical, laboratory, and life safety businesses here at Intertek. And today I am so thrilled to be joined by my guest, Evan Campbell. Evan, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so delighted to have you here. So as I always like to start all of our episodes, would love for you to introduce yourself, give a little bit of your background, what your specialty is, and what you do.
Sure. My name's Evan Campbell. I have been at Intertek for about 2.5 years now. Before that, my background was primarily in biomedical engineering. And over the course of my time at Intertek, it has primarily been focused on patient lifts.
Yes, which we're very excited to talk about that today, especially with everything that we're seeing with the development of more home care and home-based products, right? We're seeing a lot more of these types of patient lifts, electrically powered patient lifts. So becoming definitely more critical in both a clinical setting as well as in, these home care settings or other types of facilities. So when you think about this, both in a clinical versus a home care setting, what are some of the risks that we're seeing and how do we think about, mitigating these risks for both the patients and the caregivers?
Yeah, exactly. And patient lifts help mitigate a ton of risks when it comes to supporting and rehabbing and mobilizing patients that need it. Some of those risks, for example, with a caregiver, manually lifting a patient is very harmful. It can be if the patient were to fall or the caregiver slips. It could not only injure the patient, but injure the caregiver themselves. So with patient lifts, you inherit a number of risks, but those risks with patient lifts are far outweighed than the risks associated with manual lifting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to that point, now that we're seeing more and more people wanting to stay in their homes, right, or receiving care in their homes or being in facilities, not necessarily being in a hospital type setting, right, it becomes even more critical to have, all of those safety precautions in place for both, as you say, the patient themselves, but also someone who would be expected to be lifting or caregiving for the patient. So I know, in your past and your experience and things that you worked on, there's a couple of different standards that we touch on when we're looking at these types of products. So the ISO 10535, as well as our base 60601 standard. And I know manufacturers have to kind of navigate that difficult spot between complying with, you can't just comply with one, you can't, you have to find a way to comply with both of these standards. So when you're looking at it, are you able to give, a breakdown of how we interpret or how we utilize these two standards in tandem with each other?
Yeah, exactly. So with ISO 10535, we essentially treat it as a collateral standard like we would any other -2 standard. And what we do is we use 60601 as our general standard and ISO 10535 as a supporting standard, where 10535 is primarily focused on the functionality, the overall duration, and durability of the lift over its expected lifetime, and other mechanical and structural requirements, and even ergonomic factors to make sure that they're easy to use for the operators and whoever may be controlling the lift, where 60601 then is primarily focused on the basic safety and electrical safety of the lift itself, making sure that there's no shock and burn hazards. And they actually work fairly surprisingly well together because they don't overlap a ton and they don't step on each other's toes. There's some overstep when it comes to the different mechanical requirements, but not a lot, not as much as we would see in other collateral standards. So it actually provides a pretty well-rounded approach to their compliance using these two together.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because you kind of touched on it a little bit, but sometimes you see manufacturers, especially with these types of products in this kind of category, that think, 60601, this doesn't apply to our product. Like, we're not a traditional medical device, right? Our product is non-invasive, right? The contact that we have, right? So, and this assumption obviously can be super risky. So when you think about it, when someone says, 60601 doesn't really apply to this type of product, why is that, a risky assumption or a dangerous assumption to make, especially in, today's regulatory environment?
Yeah. And thankfully, this is becoming less and less common. But from my understanding and what I've experienced in the past is a lot of manufacturers would classify their patient lifts more as assistive products rather than medical devices. And what they would, for example, with overhead lifts specifically, what they could say is that the attachment is what supports the patient. It's a separate attachment, and it's not necessarily in contact with the patient. So they would say that there's no applied parts, and they could technically get out of 60601 testing if they went that path. But it's really not the case, because at the end of the day, your customers and the regulatory bodies are going to want to make sure that this has met the requirements for 60601, because they need to make sure that their users and their patients are safe from the electrical hazards identified in 60601, as well as all of those other functional and mechanical hazards in 10535. So,
yeah, it's so true. And right, I mean, of course, we're seeing in the regulatory space as well, like with the FDA, with the notified bodies, right? Everyone is more stringent about what they classify as a medical product and what is going into a medical environment. So some things that maybe in the past or under older versions of the standard, people would use, different standards instead of 60601. We're really not seeing that as commonly anymore, just because you're going to face significant regulatory hurdles if you're trying to go to one of the big markets, like, anywhere in the US, or if you're trying to go to the European Union. So I think that's such a good point. When you're looking at this and doing these evaluations, right, people always want to know what are some of the common challenges or failures that you're seeing, right, when someone is trying to go through testing for 60601 or even for the 10535. What are some of the common things that we see as failures or points of challenge when someone is trying to go through this testing?
Right. I think the biggest thing that I see, and I've heard of seeing with medical lifts or patient lifts during 60601 testing, is temperatures. When you're running motor utilizing equipment, it tends to run hot pretty inside. And when we do those temperature testing, we're not only going to test it while we're charging the lift if it's battery powered, but we're also going to run it under a max load for as long as the manual and the documentation says that we can. And we're going to do that at the highest of ambient environmental conditions. So it's already starting off at an extreme pace. And bouncing off of that a little bit, it's tough for manufacturers. They have to kind of find a good balance and walk a tight line in designing their enclosures and the internal components of these lifts, because not only do they have to make sure that there's sufficient cooling so that they don't exceed temperatures, and sufficient ventilation so that if they're using a battery, that the gases can escape from those batteries outside of the enclosure. But depending on the use environment, they also have to meet ingress requirements. And for 10535 specifically, there are some ingress requirements, and there's also noise reduction requirements. So they need to have an enclosure that's sealed enough to muffle out that noise and keep the ingress out, but they also need to be able to cool and vent sufficiently.
Yeah, so it can be a little bit trickier than maybe initially anticipated, of course. And I think, the other thing we see too, right, with all these types of products is now they're having to be designed for a much wider range of patients, right? Where previously, the size and shape and body weight of a patient, they might be looking at a certain parameter. And now, there's a much wider spectrum. And so you're dealing with a lot more when you're coming up with these designs. It's not as simple as you think, which is why when we think about, applying 60601 and applying the testing, it becomes so critical. And you touched on a little bit, right, when we're talking about some of the documentation and risk factors and things like that. So the other part about it, of course, is the 14971 element, the risk management element, and, how you identify all of those risks when you're looking for your planning process for testing and your approval for a powered patient lift. So are there things that you see when looking at risk management or looking at 14971 overall, and how that kind of plays hand in hand before you get the testing started?
Yeah, with 14971, it's obviously the backbone for really all types of medical devices. But with patient lifts specifically, you inherit a lot of risks. When you have a patient that needs a patient lift, if they have injuries or disabilities, when you're essentially suspending them in the air, that alone drives the need for some serious risk mitigations. For example, what happens if your battery dies or there's a electrical supply failure? Is your motor going to drop the patient? Is it going to leave them in the air hanging? What types of risks do those pose? Which is why ISO 14971 is so great, because if you start it early in your design process, it really helps you identify all of those potential risks in the beginning of the design process and far after the design is completed and evolving as your risk management is evolving with it. So it really helps you identify all of those potential points of failure or hazardous situations and mitigate them down to the lowest risk as possible to ensure patient and operator safety.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially, as you're developing the test plan and wanting to understand exactly what the risk might be. And that can, of course, sometimes dictate how we do testing or change the testing. So always important to consider that upfront, as you said, as part of the design phases, knowing that it's a living, breathing document and things could change as you're going through the process and getting, everything ready to go. But so critical, as you say, when you're thinking about is maybe people think of lifts as something simple, but when you're talking about suspending a patient, an overhead lift, something that could be suspending someone high in the air or in surgery, moving someone back and forth, right? Someone who's unconscious, right? There's so many things that are then needed to be considered as part of the overall risk.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then, we also see, in addition to some of these like critical care settings where we're seeing these lifts, as we talked a little bit about at the beginning, right? We're also seeing more of these types of products and lifts going into a home healthcare setting, right? As I said, a lot of people are wanting to receive their healthcare at home. They're not wanting to be in a facility. They're not wanting to go somewhere else. And so, of course, that introduces the 60601-1-11 home healthcare standard and some additional design considerations. If someone's thinking about, you're not in a controlled facility, now you're going into someone's home, and obviously every home and every environment is different. So what do you think about when we're looking at that with these products that maybe are going into a non-professional environment?
Yeah, and for home healthcare specifically, it's awesome that patients are able to utilize these lifts in their home healthcare because not only is it convenient for them not to go to the hospital, but it can help with their feeling of independence. Especially these lifts they can be operated by the patient themselves, so they don't have to rely on a caregiver. But when you go into a home healthcare environment, you have to take a lot of considerations into the fact the biggest thing is that you're putting your device in an uncontrolled environment. You're no longer in a clinical setting. Everything else has to be considered. What happens if your lift is used on or near a bathroom? Is the steam and the humidity going to come into effect of that? What happens from if you have dogs or cats? Is the fur going to get inside and cause an effect, or exposed sunlight? What happens if there is no longer a stable electrical power supply with backup generators that you see at a hospital? Or if you're driving a mobile lift and you run over a cord or an obstacle on the ground, is it going to tip over with the patient inside of it? So there's a lot of those unknown hazards that you have to be aware of. Essentially, you need to prepare for the uncontrolled, which is tough to do. And the other thing you have to consider is your lift needs to be easy enough to use and understand all of the markings and documentation for what we call a lay operator or someone that's not a professional medical caregiver.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And we talk about this a lot when we've talked about home healthcare products and devices, right? It does no good if the patient's not going to use it, right? So you have to make it in a way that someone understands how to use it and can use it on a regular basis. So I love thinking about home healthcare environments. Obviously, everyone's home is different. Every environment is different. And you think about kids and pets and all the things that you just described that can cause all sorts of foreseeable incidences. So it's so important to think about when you're designing these products for the home. You touched on batteries a little bit, right? We're seeing, how popular batteries are becoming, of course, with lots of medical products and devices and, the advancements in battery technology. So are there things aside from the discussion, right, with the enclosures and making sure things don't overheat? And, you have to think about a lot of those kind of things. Are there other things with batteries that we think about when we're talking about these types of products, or common pitfalls that we see when identifying batteries to go into these types of products?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is making sure that the battery you select for your lift is designed to be used in that type of equipment. So, for example, in 10535, it's actually a requirement that once your low battery alarm goes off, you need to be able to do one full cycle of lifting before the lift stops working. Reason being for that is, what if the battery dies while a patient is suspended midair? So there's a lot of things like that you really have to take into design consideration. Is the battery acceptable there? So,
yeah, I think that's so critical. The other thing we mentioned when we were talking about the enclosures and the seals and everything was IP testing, right? And we see, stricter IP requirements that are going to come out with the new 60601 4th edition. IP is obviously a big topic. So, oftentimes that gets overlooked, I think, on the front end. People don't consider, exactly what they're going to have to do for an IP rating, especially when we were just talking about, right, a home setting, steam, right, things like that, or in a clinical setting where something could be spilled. So are there things that, people are underestimating when they think about IP or overlooking that if they're not thinking about that kind of in the early portions of their design process?
Yeah, definitely. It needs to be one of the first things that you consider because 10535 itself has some pretty strict IP requirements where if your lift or the accessories or the equipment, if it's even possible for them to be splashed during normal use, it needs to be a minimum of IPX4. If it can be submerged, a minimum of IPX7, which those are pretty strict IP ratings. And as we talked about earlier, balancing that design out to allow for sufficient cooling and things of that nature. But then depending on what type of use environment you intend your lift for, you need to make sure that you're designing to meet those requirements for home healthcare. I think it's IP21 or IP22 that you have to meet. So when you don't consider these things early, if you were to go to a test lab and they find an issue, now not only are you going to have to go back and make a redesign, which could delay your product launch and things of that nature, and it's cost effective as well, you're going to have to go back and get it retested once you do that redesign. And depending on the severity or the impact of the design change you made, not only will you have to retest ingress, but it might prompt some retesting of other things that have already been tested.
Yeah, so true. And everyone wants to avoid retesting, of course, right? So always important to think about things early on, which is, a great tip. You've given some other kind of great tips and thoughts that we've gone through, right? Especially thinking about early compliance, your design process, your documentation, your risk, right? Are there any other tips or tricks you have for people who are trying to streamline this process or when they're thinking about getting started or they're thinking about the compliance process with these types of products?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is start your risk management early. It should be the very first thing you do with that and define your essential performance. Those two things are going to drive how your product is tested, and that's going to help. Knowing how your product is tested is going to help with your design process as well. And on top of that, get to a test lab as soon as you can, because they're going to be able to do construction reviews for you or design reviews and point out possible issues that we can foresee coming, and that will help with your design review, or that'll help with your process of your design. But one other thing is that seems to always be helpful is use pre-certified components whenever you can. It saves a lot of headaches and it limits the amount of testing and therefore money that needs to be spent on your approval process, like batteries, power supplies. It's just always easier and makes everything faster.
Yes, it's such good tips, right? Of course, unless you have such a custom design that you have to make something that's going to fit into whatever it is, it's like just go for those already pre-approved. It'll make your life a lot easier. And I think touching on essential performance as well, I'm so glad that you bring that up because I think a lot of manufacturers, don't really get deep enough into essential performance early on. And, they can always come and engage with us and have discussions and, tell us what they think their essential performance is, walk through the standards, right? Have those discussions because it's so important to identify that on the front end before you get into the actual testing and compliance process. So really great tips. Obviously you're in this day in and day out, you're working with a lot of these different types of products. Are there things that you see coming if we're looking forward, with these types of products in terms of technology or standards as designs are evolving or things are, getting smarter and connected, right? Are there things that you're seeing in this space specifically with these types of products?
Yeah, we're already seeing patient lifts and lifts working with them that are starting to be controlled from smartphones, from apps, or from a central. They're fully automated and controlled from a centralized control station, and they're unmonitored. There's no attendant needed during these lifts. They can pick a patient up and move them around the hospital all from the touch of a button in a control station. So what the standards are going to be evolving and what manufacturers need to be prepared for is with this inherits a risk of cybersecurity that standards are going to be placing a big emphasis on. So you really need to stay on top of it, make sure that your software quality is up to date and sound and don't get caught behind.
Yeah, I think that's such a great part to end on, right? Because it's amazing, right, to see the advancements in technology, but on the back end too, as you say, really to consider those risks and things that get included when you're talking about adding something that's connected in cyber and things like that. So, of course, if people have questions on that, they can reach out to us as well. We're happy to have those discussions. Really great to chat with you today, Evan. Thank you so much for joining us.
You as well. Thank you for having me.